would at least do it for mine. Okay. All right. For those who did not catch on the video, that was Brother Clay reading the Jellisons. That's our missionaries over to Japan. And, of course, there, if we'll remember on prayer, I'll mention that again here, prayer on his help. They had those new births there in their church home back in Japan with those families there. So be in prayer on that. Then his son just joined in the military. And then he also mentioned, this means something here to me, on them trying to get military flights back over to Japan. Of course, military is shut down. And I mentioned here this last week, I've got my brother who is planning on getting married here on May the 16th, Saturday, May 16th, so here in a couple weeks. And I've got a brother-in-law who's a Marine and a brother-in-law who's in the Navy, and both of those guys are supposed to be in the wedding out there in Indiana, and right now they don't have permission to travel. And so just be in prayer for, of course, all the things that are transpiring and changing going on. Some states opening up, some states trying to, it seems like putting on more restrictions. And so just pray for our town, our state, our area. Just go through that list as you're praying and think about what those different individuals are facing and dealing with as you pray with the Lord on that. City, state, our nation, and around the world, different ones facing different things. And of course, we'll mention again here, be in prayer for the Jellisons and all of our missionaries, Jellisons here, missionaries to Japan. As far as our announcements go, I've mentioned here this coming Sunday, May 3rd, we've got the Barnetts, who are missionaries to the Navajo. And Brother Haynes, for years, of course, out there on the Navajo reservation, saw a young lady, I don't know all their testimony, Tiffany was her name. And do you know, was it Yazzie, Miss Hannah? Tiffany Yazzie. It's a pretty popular family name up in the Navajo reservation. Tiffany, she got saved, went to Bible college, and met Brother Justin Barnett. The Lord had called him to missions. And so there through training and Bible college and working with Brother Haynes out there on the Navajo reservation. Now they've been there for a few years after raising some support and a church plant. And so they're needing some additional support. And so they're trying during times like this where there's not hardly any travel going on, trying to get out and trying to raise additional support to get a church plant going there on the Navajo reservation. They're down in our area this next week, going to be with us Sunday. So they'll be out here for the drive-up service that we've got planned out here on May 3rd. And so we'll kind of get to know them as we can on Sunday. So you want to be sure to be here for that. Then also on that Sunday where my family, we're gone, we've got Brother Esteban Montoya, and faithful man of God there, planning on being here with us on that Sunday, May the 17th. And then we have the Shipman family, the Sunday before Memorial Day. So Memorial Day weekend, they're going to be with us there on that Sunday. So remember those announcements there. I do want to mention here Sunday school teachers. If anybody can, make sure that you are having at least some form of contact with your Sunday school kids. Reach out to every one of them. Write them letters. And I would encourage you to at least call them. At least call them. And if you can go by, I'd encourage you to visit them. They don't come outside. At least you wave at them through the window or something like that. So try to get in contact with your Sunday school class. I know the van workers and bus routes, I know they've been out reaching out to their riders, but everybody needs to have contact with your Sunday school class. So please do that. I know I need to do that as well. Sunday school teachers, you want to do that. Right now we're looking at starting Sunday school probably going to be that first week of June. That first week of June should be able to be full blast. Everybody going out, and as long as things are normalized there, if you will, we'll plan on starting Sunday school, junior church, children's church, all of that first part of June. Acts chapter 15 here tonight. Acts chapter 15, just a couple of thoughts for us this evening as we close out this chapter and this passage here. You remember how the passage started off with you had an argument, you had a fight. You ever get in a fight? You ever get in an argument? I know you all are good Christians, and I know none of you ever fight or fuss or get offended or stress out in any way. But here in Acts chapter 15, they had honest people. And they did have fights. Yes, they did have arguments. They had a discussion. There was no small contention there. And of course, the devil, that's his plan in having those things, is to try to discourage Christians, try to disrupt the church and God's work. And of course, they went back, did things the right way, did things the biblical way, were able to resolve that. And we looked at last week how the devil, what he was able to do, how he was able to capitalize on people's emotions, able to use individuals' pride, and was able to disrupt what was planned there, beginning in verse 36. So let's read some of those verses. Acts 15, verse 36. And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, Let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder, one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. It's interesting, and it's sad to see that very often in life, the people that you would think and the people that you would feel like you could trust the most, it's the biggest hurt, and it's one of the saddest things to see. Somebody that you thought would never turn their back on you, somebody that you thought would always be on your side, to see that, boy, now we're enemies. Now we never talk to each other anymore. Now because of something that was said, something that was done, and now, boy, just the disruption that can take place. And that's something, again, it's a sad truth. And the people that you would least expect are usually the ones that are going to be the ones that surprise you and hurt you the most. And that really is kind of what happened here with Paul and Barnabas. Because you remember Paul, the disciples there early on, the apostles, none of them trusted Paul because of his history and because of his background. But it was Barnabas that came in. Barnabas was the one that stood up and said, Hey, I'm on your side, Paul. I believe you. It was Barnabas that kind of took him under his wing and took him around and greeted all the other apostles. And he was the one that introduced them and that go-between there. And here as they went out and started missions, a brand new idea to leave Israel, to leave the promised land, to leave the place where the Christ, the Messiah, was supposed to come. And hey, we're going to get on a boat and we're going to go out and we're going to go introduce some other people, tell them about the gospel. And here we have modern day missions because of Paul and Barnabas. And here they departed asunder. What the devil couldn't do through the church, what he couldn't do in those other means, here he was able to do in this passage. And we talked about that. There's a discussion about who was in the right. Was Paul or Barnabas in the right? And I'm going to lay out my arguments here this evening. This is, I personally believe Paul was in the right. And I believe because of some of these things that I'll mention here in a minute, I do believe it was a mistake for Barnabas, the decision that he made. They both came there in verse 36, and they said, Hey, let's go back and let's go visit those churches that we had traveled to. And we're going to go out there. And of course, Barnabas says, Hey, that's Paul. That sounds great. I believe the Lord's in that. Let's do that. Let me go get John Mark and I'll bring him along. Paul said, Oh, wait a second. He said, Barnabas, he says, I don't think you want to bring John Mark. You remember when we went last time, we went to Crete, and it came time for the work, and John Mark left. And Paul says, Barnabas, I'm not wanting to bring him again. Barnabas, of course, he said, I want John Mark. John Mark needs to come. He needs to be here. And I think, again, I believe Paul was in the right. One of the reasons, and I mentioned this last week, one of the reasons I believe Paul was in the right is because this is the last mention that you have of Barnabas in the Bible narrative. Paul will refer back to him as he's recounting this story. His name comes up, but it's past tense. From this point on, you no longer hear anymore about the son of consolation. You no longer hear about, that's what his name means, Barnabas. The one who would bring comfort, the one who would help, the exhorter, the guy who'd come alongside. His ministry, as far as we know, ends right here in this story. And you can see how the Bible, it continues and goes on. The Holy Spirit continues to record the Apostle Paul and his ministry. That's one of the other reasons that I believe that Paul was in the right. There, verse 41, Acts 15:41. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. Chapter 16, verse 1. Then came he to Derbe and Lystra. Notice, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek. This here is the introduction to Timothy. Believe most likely he was saved on that first missionary journey, and now Paul comes and he's been faithful that time while they've been gone, and faithful during all that the opposition there in Acts chapter 15. And Timothy now over here in Lystra. Now he is the young man that is able to be brought in. I think if Barnabas had done things right with John Mark, I think potentially Timothy, I think maybe if John Mark had been there, maybe Timothy hadn't been in the ministry. Maybe if things had been different with John Mark. Again, you can't draw any real conclusions from that. All we can do is just suppose. But here, God's plan was not for John Mark at this time, but God's plan was for Timothy, the young man, here to come into play at this point. Paul there, back in chapter 15 and verse number 40, Paul, he chooses Silas. And Paul takes Silas out, and they're the ones that head on. I want you to look at a reference, would you, at 1 Timothy chapter 3. Find 1 Timothy chapter 3. One of the other reasons that I believe Barnabas was wrong, and I believe the Apostle Paul was right, it's likely that Paul's judgment of John Mark was correct. He said, John Mark, he is not ready. He's not ready. You got young people. You ever get told you're not old enough? You want to hop behind that steering wheel and you want to start driving. Oh, you're not old enough yet. Not old enough yet. Just because even I've learned, especially driving around here in this area, that just because the state says you're old enough to get a driver's license doesn't necessarily mean that you're old enough to get a driver's license. Right. Do you remember that as a kid? Remember teenagers going off and they'd have the youth activities, and boy, the juniors is bedtime. Didn't get to go out and do that. I thought, boy, I can't wait till someday when I'm old enough. Now I'm old enough, and you wish you could go back, don't you? Paul looked at John Mark, and he said, John Mark, he said, to a certain extent, spiritually, you're not old enough. Spiritually, you're not ready. You need some maturity. It's not just, when it comes to God's will, Brother Clay and I talking about God's will a fair amount here this week. When it comes to God's will, it's not just desire, and it's not just opportunity. Just because there's the zeal and the desire to do something, and just because maybe there's an open door there, does not determine, those things do not determine God's will. John Mark and Barnabas, maybe John Mark had the zeal and the desire. He said, you know what, I think I want to go ahead and go on this next missionary journey. But Paul said, I don't want him there. He said, I don't believe he's mature enough yet. And Paul, again, what if the Holy Spirit was saying, look, if John Mark goes, he's not mature enough yet, he's not ready yet, and he quits again, he will be totally and completely removed from ever being used of the Lord. Again, John Mark, he would later come back to be used, and Paul would later on be able to say, hey, John Mark has now reached a point where he is beneficial to me. But just because you have an opportunity and just because you have the desire does not determine God's will. I try to teach my daughter, same thing I was taught as a kid. Just because he tells you how pretty you are, And just because He tells you how much that He loves you, and just because He's asking you, hey, will you marry me, doesn't mean that you have to say yes. All right, I got little Aiden here tonight. Aiden, just because you think that girl's pretty, just because you like her, man, I wish you all could see his face right now. Just because the desire is there and just because the opportunity is there does not determine, that is not the defining thing for God's will. You think about David. He's the guy that comes to my mind just immediately. I think about David. You know, sometimes it was David going out. He's never touched any, he's never been trained as a soldier. He's never carried the armor. He's not been out in the battle. All he has been doing is taking care of the sheep. But God chooses him to kill the giant Goliath. Sometimes you don't have an army, and sometimes you don't have the opportunity, and you're just there on your own facing the giant. Sometimes you've got the army, and David, he's there with Abishai, and he's going out with the army, and God says, go out and you go kill them Philistines, and they go and they fight the army. The next time, they've got the opportunity, the Philistines are there, they've got the army, and they're ready to go. God says, nope. Wait. Hold up. Y'all stay back here in the brush and in the bushes. I'm going to send my Spirit down ahead of you. You need to wait. It's not just zeal. It's not just opportunity. Just because you have those things available does not mean and does not dictate that it is God's will. No doubt in my mind that in Faith Baptist Church and the individuals maybe even watching here tonight, there is no doubt in my mind that some, especially in a time like this, you're thinking, you know what, maybe we need to get a different job, maybe a different place. And you might think, you know what, look, there's this opportunity here. It must be the Lord's will. There is no doubt in my mind that the devil would seek to capitalize on that. And it wouldn't surprise me one bit if the other was true. You're saying, boy, I'm in a position where we're making good money and things are set here, but things spiritually are not what they should be. God knows that. God says things could be better for you if you'd, maybe not financially better, but God says, hey, you know what? Yeah, I'd rather have you over here. And you're saying, you know what, boy, we're going to stay right where we are. Again, God's will. Just because the desire is there, just because the opportunity is there, you're there. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. Notice the require for a preacher. Notice right off, verse 6. Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Well, I think about with people who are feeling that call to preach. I've known young men. I've known men who they had the ability to be able to stand up in front of people and with a Bible open up and, boy, challenge people from the pulpit. They had the, quote, ability to do that. But in their life, the decisions they made, they were not ready. And it is very clear the way they're living now, completely out of God's will. Completely out of God's will. It is very clear they were not ready for the ministry. Not a novice, he said. Just because you have the desire there. Just because the opportunity is there. Somebody says, hey, there's an opportunity for you to do this job or to have this here. Or again, somebody says, will you marry me? Glad my wife didn't tell all the guys who are coming around asking to marry her. Glad she didn't tell them yes. Not a novice. Paul looked at John Mark and he said, you know what? He's a novice. He is not ready yet. When it comes to God's will, it is absolutely paramount that you and I are on our face before God seeking the Holy Spirit's direction. That is the only way to know what God's will is. He says, not a novice about John Mark. He says he's not ready. Back there in Acts chapter 15. One of the things that I think about Barnabas, why I don't believe he was in God's will, is he says there in verse 36 and 37, he says, yep, it's God's will for us to go and take that missionary journey. Is that what Barnabas did? No, that's not what he did. To me, if your attitude is that, well, carnal Christians, they're the ones that will claim that, well, God has changed his mind. I remember here, the one lady, she said, well, it was God's will for me to marry that individual there, and it was God's will for me to divorce him, and now it's God's will for me to marry this guy number 3. God doesn't change his mind like that. That is not how God operates. Barnabas said, you know what, God's called us to go, but now, again, one of the reasons I believe Barnabas ends up out of God's will is because he did not obey God's will. I think it's really just about as clear and as plain as that. He ends up out of the ministry, being out. He is no longer, to our knowledge, again, I'm sure God didn't throw him away, but as far as the world missions is concerned, as far as his purpose there in the early church, and as far as his purpose for Barnabas being there in Acts of the Apostles, Barnabas is gone. Barnabas is gone. The last, and I believe the most important thing that I see in this story that tells me that Paul was in the right, is there in verse number 40. Acts chapter 15, verse 40. Paul chose Silas and departed, notice here, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. Paul, he heads out with Silas, but it is not Paul, his decision, so much as it is, you see there, the church, the brethren, they're the ones that recommend it. They're the ones that send him out. And this is true here in the book of Acts, true here today. Any, quote, church work that is being done for Christ today, it is going to be done following the Bible examples. Any ministry work, you can get things done. You know, I believe the Lord, even the high priest, you remember the high priest who crucified Christ? The high priest, God used him to prophesy, saying that one man would die for the nation. Jesus Christ, the one man, would die for the nation as he is signing his death warrant. He said, you know what? God said, I'm going to use the high priest here in that instance. I am sure there are ministries that are out there that are being used. I'm sure there's preachers on TV that people are listening to, maybe even old Smiling Joel. He gets picked on a lot. You know, I almost feel bad for him, but then I see the pictures of his mansion and all that, and I don't feel bad for him anymore. I bet you there are people who watch even him on TV, and I'm sure the Lord can use that to a certain extent. But think, friend, think of what impact people would have and be able to do, the impact and influence that the gospel would be able to have if people would do things God's way, the Bible way. Paul in his ministry, he said, you know what? We're going to go back to the church, we're going to go back to the brethren and see what they recommend, see what they do. And you do not see that with Barnabas. That did not happen with Barnabas. Here in this story, Barnabas, he is offended, he is upset, and he says, I think here in this story, it comes across to me at least, and maybe I'll meet Barnabas someday up in heaven, and he'll say, maybe Paul and Barnabas will say, no, preacher Reitz, you got it all wrong. And this here, it looks like he got a little bit of a hothead and said, Paul, I'm done with you. Didn't want to ask the church because he probably knew what they'd tell him. And he says, you know what? We're going to go and we're going to do things this way. Did you ever do that? I've done that. I avoid the people because I know they're going to tell me what I don't want to hear, like Dad. I remember not asking him for some advice because I knew what he'd tell me. And it wasn't what I wanted to hear. He'd say, don't buy that car on eBay. Well, I learned that one the hard way. Learned that one the rough way. And I don't think he went back to the church because I don't think he wanted to hear what they had to say. So you think about what do we have here in Acts chapter 15. You have a problem here at the beginning of Acts chapter 15. They did things what? The Bible way. They did things the right way. They went through the authority. They went through the church. Again, God gives you those things, not because He's mean, not because they think that the Christians at church are so much better, or the preacher at the church are so much better, or that your mom and dad are so much better, or that the boss, or any of that. God just says, you know what, you do things that way because that's the way I've set it up. And He says, if you want to know what I think, God says, if you want to know what I think, you'll do it my way. You had that problem there at the first part of Acts chapter 15. They did things God's way, and God's word increased. Trouble ceased. They were at peace, and they had great joy. That is not how Barnabas left. That is not how it ended with Paul and Barnabas. They did not do things God's way, and I believe the devil was able to bring about a victory because of that. Any work that you and I want to do, you'll notice that last part there in verse number 40. It says, Paul chose Silas and departed, what? Being recommended by the brethren, well, I like this, unto the grace of God. Unto the grace of God. Anything that you and I do, we had better make sure that we have it's done under the grace of God. Well, we need God's grace. My prayer request here tonight for us and our church as we endeavor to obey God's will. I believe everyone here tonight, everyone that's listening here, I believe you and I, we're wanting God's will done in us. We're wanting to make the right decisions. We're not wanting to fight. We're not wanting to get out of sorts and get out of God's will. We're wanting to be obedient to the will that God has for us. The only way that's going to be done is if we have and employ God's grace. Boy, I think two things, and we'll close here with these thoughts. Be in prayer for yourself. God, would you give me your grace? Paul knew it wasn't his abilities. He learned that. God reminded him with that thorn in the flesh. Paul, it's not you. It's by my grace. It's in your weaknesses that my strength will come out. Be in prayer for one another on that. We read Brother Jellison's prayer letter tonight. Every one of you ought to be praying for the Jellisons here this evening. Every one of you ought to be praying that the missionaries that are sent out and are a part of the ministry of Faith Baptist Church have God's grace on them. But you and I, we need to be in prayer for one another. You ought to think about the church folks and think about the church family. You ought to be praying for them. Shouldn't be, if you're not able to be here in the facilities, be here in the building, you ought to at least be in spirit, be in prayer for one another. When was the last time you prayed for the Sunday school teachers? Last time you prayed for the nursery workers and the people cleaning up the church facilities? And hey, man, be in prayer for your pastor. Be in prayer for the preacher. We are all in need of God's grace. I think of 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, what? You and I were to do everything. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says we are to do it all to the glory of God. And that's what we want. It's not about Paul. It's not about Barnabas. It's not about Jacob Reitz. It's not about you. It's about the glory of God. Let's close with a word of prayer. God, we do ask that you'd help us here tonight. Help us to understand these principles and these truths. Help us to put them into practice. Help us to be yielded to your will, obedient to it. I pray that you'd help us, Lord, to wait when we're supposed to wait, to take action when it's time to take action. And God, I pray that you'd empower every one of us tonight with your grace as we seek to give you glory. We ask these things in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.